Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending the Northern Marianas Humanities Council's Humanities Friday webinar. October is Humanities Month here in the CNMI, and we at the Humanities Council have been celebrating by holding 2 Zoom webinars every Friday of the month at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., each featuring a different humanities topic. This afternoon, we are joined by Tiningo, who will be presenting on the portrayal of, quote, ordinary women in Chamorro narratives and literature. So please note that these events are supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and that any opinions or conclusions presented during the Humanities Fridays presentations do not necessarily reflect the perspective of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Also, a little webinar housekeeping. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the presentation and will be asked to save any chat messages for after the presentation, during which there will be a question and answer period until we close out the hour. Depending on the number of questions, we may unmute attendees for this portion or simply use a moderator to relay questions. And for those of you tuning in on Facebook Live, you can send your questions by messaging the Northern Marianas Humanities Council through the Facebook page. Okay, so without further ado, Kaylee, I'll give it to you and you can go ahead and do your presentation. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Sophia. Have a day, everyone. Thank you for attending my presentation titled Tiningo Famalåo'an, Oral Histories and Nonfiction Stories of Chamorro Women. I realize that you could be doing any number of things, so I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to my presentation. Again, my name is Tiningo, and in front of you, you will see 3 images from left to right: my great-great-grandmother, Maria Pereda, my great-grandmother, Maria Pereda Valenzuela, and my grandma, Roslyn Valenzuela Tiningo. And the baby in all of their arms is my mother, Carla Valenzuela Tiningo. And this is my lineage. So before I start, I'd like to offer a brief resume, if you will. I graduated from UOG with my bachelor's in 2017 and my master's in 2020, both in English literature, but somehow I still come home from the grocery store with the wrong thing because I didn't read the label right, so make of it what you will. So I'm now teaching senior composition at my alma mater, Academy of Our Lady of Guam. I'd like to begin by addressing one of the reasons I began this research. I am Chamorro Japanese, and although I was raised in a Chamorro household, I often felt very disconnected from the culture. So conducting this research gave me an opportunity through reading historical texts and through discussing the experiences of my interviewees to learn more about our cultural values and what it means to be a Chamorro woman. So the idea for this project began with a conversation I had with my grandma. I had just started the graduate program, and meanwhile, many of my friends were getting married and building houses and having babies. And I shared this observation with my grandma, and she reminded me that I had made a choice. And as I reflected on this conversation, I realized I had known my grandma as the lady who made champaladu and finadeni sardines for me, but I had no idea who she was outside of being my grandma. And I had no idea what her life choices looked like. And these life choices essentially culminated in my whole family's existence. And so I had all of these questions. Were her parents involved in her decisions? Were there social or ideological influences that impacted her choices? And so when I finally asked my grandma if I could interview her for my thesis, she said, "Sure, but my life isn't interesting. No one's going to read it." And so, armed with all of these questions and my grandma's apprehension about her own story, I searched for women-centered texts, and I read texts like Laura Torres Souder's Daughters of the Island, Contemporary Chamorro Women Organizers on Guam, and Guampedia's Famalåo'an Guåhan, Women in Guam History. And what I found was that the women represented in these texts weren't necessarily like my grandmother. They were referred to in the text as organizers and extraordinary women in Guam history. And these women did much of their work in the public eye. And so the only work produced that I could find that came close to what I was looking for was Leona Nahalaba'a's documentary, Mothering Guåhan, which discussed the roles of mothers through intergenerational interviews. So I realized that the only way for my grandma to see the value her life experiences can bring to our understanding of Chamorro culture and Chamorro womanhood is if I developed short stories informed by her experiences and the experiences of my interviewees. So through these creative nonfiction short stories, my hope is that I'll be able to bridge the gap between academic research and our island communities. So, what does my research focus on? My research primarily looks at the familial, educational, and occupational choices of Chamorro women and the ways Chamorro values, gender roles, and behaviors, as well as Catholicism and US colonization, impact those choices. And so I use the term Tiningo Famalåo'an to refer to the knowledge shared by the Chamorro women interviewees. This knowledge or cultural repository, Tiningo Famalåo'an, stems from cultural values, gender roles, and behaviors, Catholicism, and US colonization. So when we think about Tiningo Famalåo'an coming together and influencing Chamorro women's choices, we can imagine a Chamorro woman standing at the intersections of Chamorro values, Catholicism, and US colonization. And this term, intersectionality, was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a feminist scholar and activist who used the term to label the ways that African American women were being impacted by racism and sexism at the same time. So I use this term not so much to focus on the negative impacts that social structures can have on Chamorro women, but the ways that Chamorro values, Catholicism, and US colonization both positively and negatively affect Chamorro women. So, in talking about the choices that Chamorro women make, their familial, educational, and occupational choices, and the social structures that are starting to impact those choices, we can think about agency. And agency is one's ability to make choices. And the theory that I use in my research considers agency as affected by the social structures that an individual is a part of. And so the relationship that an individual has with any given social structure determines how much influence that social structure has on their ability to make choices. So if we think about Catholicism, if my interviewees were devout Catholics, which they all are, then Catholicism would have a considerable influence on their choices. And this is the same for their relationships with the Chamorro culture and with Western culture. So depending on what the specific social structure is and the individual's relationship with that social structure, their ability to make choices and the choices available to them will either be broadened or narrowed. So, informed by these definitions of intersectionality and agency, I ask the following research questions. First, how has Tiningo Famalåo'an manifested in the familial, educational, and occupational choices of Chamorro women of the 1960s to 70s? Second, what factors influence Chamorro women's occupational choice? And third, what do the life choices of Chamorro women reveal about Chamorro values? So what did I do? This intersectional methodology lends itself to life history writing. because similar to the way intersectionality looks at the social structures that impact an individual, life history writing links oral history interviews with the analysis of the social context that stories are embedded in. I used oral history and ethnographic methods for two reasons. The first, of course, is that oral history interviews are culturally relevant. And second, as I knew my project was going to conclude with a series of creative nonfiction short stories, I needed to conduct interviews that would help me understand the people that these stories would be informed by. So essentially, the old writer saying, write what you know. I created a series of semi-structured and open-ended interview questions to uncover what choices Chamorro women made as they transitioned from adolescence to adulthood. And I asked the interviewees to recall what they decided to do post-high school graduation and how they made this decision. I began by asking them about their high school experiences to give them a jumping off point, a place to start, and begin sharing from there. I also asked them to respond to questions about career transitions and parental and spousal responsibilities. I have these pictures of fruits here because I read Linda Tuiwai Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies, Research on Indigenous Peoples. And one of the methodologies that really resonated with me was that as Indigenous researchers, we should maintain our cultural values when embarking on these research processes. And so for Chamorros, reciprocity is one of our core values. So at the time of the interviews, it was guava and avocado season. So I picked guavas from my grandma's tree and avocados from my mom's, and I made sure to give them to my interviewees as a way of just showing my gratitude. And so I used purposeful sampling to select my interview participants. Purposeful sampling is essentially selecting specific settings, types of people, or events because of the important information they can provide that can't be gotten as well from other choices. So to limit the differences in ideology, value systems, and social upbringing, Chamorro women were selected based on date of birth within a 5-year gap. Interviewees were required to meet the following parameters. Women of Chamorro descent, born on Guam between 1940 and 1945, and lived on Guam at least until 18 years old. At least one participant was selected per geographical region, northern, central, and southern Guam, to allow for differences in experiences based on upbringing within specific areas of the island. I conducted the interviews over a 2-month period, and the interviews ranged from one session to several over the course of the 2 months, depending on the interviewee's availability. So let's meet the interviewees. My first interviewee was my grandma, Roslyn Valenzuela Tiningo. She was born August 18, 1941, and at the age of 79, she is the eldest of the 3 interviewees. Roslyn was born and raised on Guam in the village of Chalampago and attended George Washington High School at its previous location in Maiti. Roslyn is the youngest of 5 children, born to a homemaker and the first commissioner of Chalampago. Roslyn attended some college at the University of San Francisco and University of San Diego. My second interviewee was my Malit's grandma, Catalina Santos Lanao, who was born in February of 1944 and is 76 years old. She was raised and has lived in Derecho her whole life, and she was part of the first freshman class of Tumon High School and graduated in 1963. In a family with 4 boys and 4 girls, Catalina is the youngest daughter of a homemaker and a public servant. Her father worked as a firefighter, police officer, and a teacher. and she attended a semester at the Territorial College of Guam. And Rosita Malian Ugin Santiago was my third interviewee, and I was introduced to her by one of the members of my cohort. Rosita was born June 8th, 1945. At 75 years old, Rosita is the youngest of my three interviewees. She was raised and has lived her whole life in the village of Umata. After her father passed away early in her childhood, Rosita was raised by her single mother. She attended Tumon High School. However, after 2 years, she chose to leave school. She later earned her GED in the adult education program at Guam Community College in 1985. All right, so the first research question that I address is, how has Tiningo Famalåo'an manifested in the familial, educational, and occupational choices of Chamorro women? Uh-oh. Share. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. The first research question that I address is, how has Tiningo Famalåo'an manifested in the familial, educational, and occupational choices of Chamorro women of the 1960s to 70s? All three interviewees acknowledged the use of chaperones before marriage as a normative family or community practice when courting. Catalina recalls how she met a Marine while she was working at NCS, Naval Communication Services, in her early 20s. That Marine later became her husband. When asked if it was necessary for her to have a chaperone on dates, Catalina replied, "Back then, you can't go anywhere without a chaperone, so one of your siblings will have to go with you." Rosita shared a similar perception when she explicitly states that her younger sibling must accompany her on any public outing, even going to the store. Roslyn, the youngest child in her family, noted that her experiences with courtship were slightly different. As the youngest child, she was the chaperone for her older sister. However, when she started dating, there was no one to chaperone her. Instead, Roslyn was trusted to behave in accordance with familial and cultural values without surveillance. So by choosing a younger sibling as a chaperone, post-World War II Chamorro norms place the power to discern whether or not a situation is appropriate in the hands of the individual being chaperoned. So the older sibling must decide if her behavior and that of her admirer is suitable for her younger sibling chaperone to witness. So while on the surface, chaperoning may seem to limit Chamorro women's agency, through an understanding of Tiningo Famalåo'an, what we see is that by placing the burden of choice on the women, the chaperoning custom neither narrows nor broadens the boundaries of Chamorro women's agency. My second research question, what factors influence Chamorro women's occupational choice? I recognized two factors in the interviewees' responses that influence their occupational choices, and was economic need and upward mobility. So for Catalina, after one semester in college, she began her career working in the government. Catalina's experience is unique among the interviewees, as she was the only interviewee who began her career prior to becoming a mother and a wife. So while she acknowledges that her natal family, her parents and siblings, did not directly influence her post-graduation decisions, Catalina indirectly addresses the benefit to herself and her family when she states, "It was a good experience because I was helping my dad. But then I have other siblings that were working, so we all help each other." Catalina's desire to give back to her father and siblings is indicative of the reciprocity inherent in Inafat Mallet. In other words, she felt a duty to give back to her parents and contribute to the improvement of her family's quality of life. While the interviewees addressed their family's economic needs as the reason why they entered the full-time workforce, what's also visible in these experiences of Rosita and Roslyn is the way that Tiningo Famalåo'an women's work has shifted. The work of being a mother has changed and is most clearly stated by Roslyn when she says, "My mom didn't work because after she got married, she started having children. It was the old days, you become a housewife, but not in our time anymore." Roslyn addresses the shift in the way Chamorro women interpreted Tiningo Famalåo'an from her mother's time, which viewed women's work as primarily maintaining the home and children, to her time, which viewed Tiningo Famalåo'an as mothers entering the workforce while also maintaining their household responsibilities. For Chamorro women like Roslyn and Rosita, the larger socioeconomic changes on Guam required them to reevaluate what their roles as caretakers looked like. So for both Roslyn and Rosita, the maintenance of the modern Chamorro household required more financially from them than parents of previous generations. And these new expenses, tuitions, mortgages, utilities, and household necessities, marked a redefinition in the responsibilities associated with Tiningo Famalåo'an, which is evident when Rosita recalls her son asking her, "Mom, how come when we move up here, we're poor?" To which she replies, "Because we have to pay the house, the power, the water." So the second factor that includes Chamorro women's occupational choice is upward mobility. Catalina describes the occupational choices that she made following her decision to leave her studies at the Territorial College and addresses her desire to progress in her career when she states, "When the federal department called me for an interview, I went because it was more pay. I was earning $1.15 when I start with Guam. And then with the federal, it was $1.99 an hour." For Catalina, upward mobility was achieved through occupational growth. And as I previously mentioned, Catalina had a desire to help her family, and earning money could help her do that. Earning more money could help her do that in a more substantial way. So for Rosita, educational development was the means to achieving greater upward mobility. Although Rosita was unable to pursue furthering her education beyond her GED, she did achieve upward mobility through on-the-job training. She began her career as a cook's helper and retired from the government of Guam as a cook, the second highest position in the cafeteria. And Roslyn began her career after taking a few years to raise her first two children. At the time, Roslyn and her husband were living in Saipan. She was able to get a job working as a secretary for a cabinet member at the Trust Territory of the Pacific. When asked if she ever pictured herself retiring as an immigration supervisor when she started her career with the federal government, Roslyn replied, "I just felt that I didn't want to be stuck in a secretarial job. I wanted to go up." Roslyn viewed work as both a necessity of motherhood and a means of upward mobility. So my third research question is, what do the life choices of Chamorro women reveal about Chamorro values? Essentially, what does this all tell us? The interviewees' life choices show us that the Chamorro values that they grew up with, that were instilled in them, like Tiningo Famalåo'an, were still present, but had taken on a new form to meet the economic and social needs of the modernizing Chamorro families. Chamorro women were redefining the roles of women and motherhood. And so the culmination of my research was the series of short stories The title of the chapter that includes my creative nonfiction short stories is Chamorro Women in the Driver's Seat, Steering and Storytelling. The first story in the chapter is Hafanaklas Palauanhau, Roslyn's Story of Womanhood. Hafanaklas Palauanhau means what kind of woman are you? And so this story follows Roslyn as a newlywed and hones in on a conversation Roslyn had with her mother about what type of wife she's supposed to be. So the second story is titled Tighten Your Belt, Catalina's Story of Reciprocity. This story focuses on Catalina's recollections of her post-graduation educational and occupational choices as she tries to find a balance between her individual growth and earning an income to help her father and siblings. The third story, Tsetulahi and Tsetsu Famalåo'an, Rosita's Chamorro fairy tale, follows Rosita through a courtship and marriage built on work ethic. Rosita challenged my perceptions of what a fairy tale was and offers Chamorro women an opportunity to see what love and gender performance look like in a Chamorro context. So I would like to conclude this presentation by reading an excerpt from Tsetulahi and Tsetsu Famalåo'an, Rosita's Chamorro fairy tale. I'm here, send. Fu'una meets me in the driveway and walks me back to the outside kitchen where I left the fruits a week before. After a few minutes, we spot Rosita walking down the little slope that leads from her garden. She was cutting flowers, heliconia and red and pink ginger that her son would later assemble into an arrangement for the church just down the hill. Fu'una introduces us. I amen her. The new way, cheek to cheek. She smiles and leads us to the back entrance. As she opens the screen door, I slip my zori off to the side and step in Rosita's home. The door is situated between the kitchen and the dining room. To the right of the doorway is a countertop that lines the perimeter of the U-shaped kitchen. The counter is covered in sparkling white square tiles, and although it's the kitchen, there is no sign of food on the counters nor dishes in the sink. Rosita walks over to her square dining table and takes a seat in one of the 4 chairs. I pick the seat to the left of her, and Fu'una falls on the couch in the living room adjacent to the dining room. After I review the contents of the folder, go through all the required academic explanations, and get her signed consent to proceed, I clip the mic to her faded t-shirt and sit back down. She jokes to Fu'una, "Oh no, I didn't do my hair. You're gonna see me on TV with my hair. Just watch, I'm gonna be famous on the TV." After I reassured her that we'd only be using audio recording, she turned to me with a laugh. "Make sure you say I have my hair and makeup." So let the record show, Rosita's hair and makeup is done. 3 months after I completed my interview with Rosita, I met with one of my thesis advisors to discuss the interview recordings. My advisor wanted to know what I found interesting or unusual. Rosita is a 74-year-old Chamorro woman who has lived her whole life in the southern village of Umatic, a village that most Guamanians might refer to as quiet. Rosita's story of how she met her husband had been replaying in my head since our interview. "Oh, it's like a fairy tale," Rosita exclaimed with a nostalgic excitement. "You know what's Mully?" "Yeah, I have a couple," I said, attempting to show her that I'm not as foreign as my Bachgoot features might suggest. She waited just long enough to hear the yeah before proceeding. In 1960, Rosita was 15 and had decided to leave Tumon Junior Senior High School because she had lost interest in school. My house and my Mully's house we were not Mully yet at the time, just neighbor, is not far, so she's always seen me doing yard work, hanging clothes outside the house. I was really doing a lot of, work, whatever I can do. Enrique, a tan, handsome young man with a full head of dark hair, slicked back like a 1960s Hollywood film star, often visited Rosita's neighbor's house. He was the first cousin of Rosita's neighbor's husband. While Rosita was out doing her many household chores, she also unknowingly caught Enrique's attention. He said to my Mali, "Man, that lady there, she really works hard. She's always doing something." And my Mali say, "Yeah, she works hard. I always watch her." My advisor suggested that I do more research into Tiningo Famalåo'an and Tattulahi. The only context I'd ever heard the terms women's work and men's work used were in discussions of Western feminist discourse. I hadn't considered that these terms already had a place in Chamorro culture. After seeing her from afar, Enrique and Rosita finally met and spent much of the next 2 years talking on Rosita's porch. Sometimes they went to parties together, but never anywhere alone. Her mother would say, "Call the younger kid, go with your sister." After 2 years of courtship, Rosita and Enrique decided to get married. Enrique's mother had passed away before they met, so when they got married, Rosita lived with her husband, father-in-law, and 2 brothers-in-law, and soon realized why her hard work drew Enrique in. No woman there to clean up after all the mess or cook, so I'm really dependable. I'm so experienced with those kind of life doing maintenance. So my husband told my Mali that he's interested in me because already in his mind, nobody else, no woman at his house to do work. So my Mali told me, "Mali, you know what makes Enrique pick you? Because he always see that you're very good in doing everything in the house, outside the house. It doesn't come to my mind whether is it because there's no woman at the house." So that's after we got married. Enrique was self-employed. Really, he makes good money, more off raising pig and selling, and the beetle nut. After Rosita and Enrique got married, Enrique and her brothers-in-law left to work, and Rosita stayed at home with her father-in-law. It's only me and him, so my father-in-law say, "I, Agahu, you know, like my daughter. Ever since you married with my son, I never get up to put me coffee. I'm always doing things that will open up his heart." And I think, lucky my husband got me, because look, there's a lot of good changes in this house. Rosita's enthusiastic recollections highlight how she felt both valued and uniquely skilled to contribute to her new family. But I found myself still puzzled by her joyful acceptance of her new responsibilities, which seemed to me inequitable. A couple of weeks after the meeting with my advisor, I stood behind my grandma with a small bunch of her freshly dyed auburn strands pressed between my fingers and spun them around a pink roller. "Grandma, what's Tiningo Famalåo'an and Tattulahi? Like, how do you understand it?" "Oh, that's, there's women's work and there's men's work. Remember, I told you about my brothers when we were young. Uncle Victor took care of the goats. Uncle Al took care of the pigs. Uncle Rick took care of the cows. After Auntie Lit, her sister, got married, Grandma took over the cleaning, laundry, and ironing. Her mother cooked and tetsled around the village, and her dad was the commissioner of Chalampago. Did you ever feel like your brothers looked down on the work you did? Did you ever feel like it had less value or importance?" I set the last roller in place at the nape of her neck. "No, I don't think any of them would have traded. Doing laundry was really hard back then." What then did Rosita mean when she said meeting her husband was like a fairy tale? To me, that word conjures up images of passion, love at first sight, and serendipity. But as Rosita's story unfolded, she unknowingly challenged my understanding of the fairy tale romance. Enrique's attraction was to Rosita's work ethic. In Enrique's home with his dad and his 2 brothers, there was Tiningo Famalåo'an to be done, but no Palauan. And so their home lacked balance. And Rosita was the one to restore harmony. Inafat Malik. So that concludes my presentation. I would like to end with a call to action to encourage everyone to record stories of their manamku, of the people in their lives. COVID has taught us that we never know how much time we're going to have. And so what better way to spend your time than to record some stories of people in your life. So obviously you would need consent, but open-ended interview questions and a recording device. It's really bare bones, that's what it is. And so I hope that leaving this presentation, you have ideas for what you can do for recording these experiences and these stories. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kaylee. That was really fascinating. And I just want to say I really appreciate you taking the time to do that work. It's really important information. So now if anyone, any attendees would like to just shoot some questions in the chat, we can start like a larger discussion. And also if you would like to just show up, like have your like face pop up and legit ask Kaylee something in person, just let me know and I can do that like in the background over here. In the meantime, I actually had a quick question for you, Kaylee. I was wondering, do you think that, I mean, obviously what we perceive as women's work has changed, right? Like everyone from the older generations to the current ones knows like a lot has changed for women nowadays. What do you think women's work looks like today? Is it still a relevant term?
Well, I think that we could still say that it is. It's just like what happened in her generations, things started to shift. And so we need to figure out what those shifts were over time. Originally, my project also included looking at women today. And then my thesis advisor said, slow down, lady, that's a dissertation. So I didn't include that.
Yeah, I guess sometimes it's just hard to even know like if it's helpful to think about things like that anymore, you know, like obviously you started studying this because you're pursuing higher education, you know, something that was not really normal or even accessible to some of the women that you interviewed, right? So
right.
I guess I just kind of wonder, especially coming from Chamorro heritage and wanting to like celebrate and perpetuate that culture, how do you balance that with wanting to sort of progress and have more opportunities as a woman? Like can there still be women's work, do you think? Like can that be something that we do proudly, or is that something we need to let go of? Like what do you think?
Well, I think that what we're doing now is still part of women's work. It's just we're constantly redefining it, and so this is our redefinition of it, is going out into the world and getting this higher education and all that. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a shift happening now that's not like it was back then even.
Definitely. Okay. Yeah. Well, it seems like everyone is basically just giving you love right now in the chat. They want more research.
Thank you.
But I haven't seen any questions. So again, attendees, if you have any questions, now's the time. And Keely, I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add or anything, yeah, that you think people should know?
Well, one of the people in the chat said that it would be really awesome to see CNMI version, and that's my hope, is that someone takes it and runs with it in their own direction and figures out what it looks like there. Because I'm sure it's not going to be exactly the same as what I found. And obviously my sample size was pretty small, so we have work to expand on.
Definitely. All right, well, I think that because we don't have any questions at this point, we can just wrap up this conversation for now. Again, thank you so much, Kaylee, for coming on and sharing your research. Super fascinating stuff. And thank you to everyone who came and listened, and also know that you'll be able to access this recording on Facebook, and we're going to put it on the Humanities YouTube channel as well. And yeah, happy Humanities Month, everybody. Thanks so much
Eva.
for tuning in. Okay, have a good one, you guys.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.